Hello, Internet. This is Toby Rice on the IFR Podcast, Season 1, Episode 3. I'm your host, a Master CFI and ATP rated pilot. Today, on this episode of the IFR Mastermind Podcast, we're going to be talking about the basics of IFR navigation. So, basically, the plan today was to do something a little bit different, and I wanted to have some people come on and ask questions on the podcast in live, and then as I had the live stream going, would answer questions and kind of go from there. However, that did not pan out today exactly as I thought it was going to. So we're going to go to plan B, which is going to be a quick lesson, just a little history lesson on the basics of IFR navigation. How do we navigate as pilots? And how can we use the history of navigation to help us better understand how to properly plan our flights and be safe pilots? So we're going to kind of dig into that right now. I have got a screen recording here set up on my iPad that if you're going to be listening to this podcast, you're not going to be able to see that, but that is okay. I'm going to be pulling this up right now, and we're going to show you a little bit of what I've got on my iPad here. So I'll be talking through this as we go so that the people who are listening and not watching will be able to still track along with what's going on. But in the meantime, here's the basics of IFR navigation. Okay, and the reason I'm talking about this, I'm very passionate about this subject because I feel like most instructors tend to overcomplicate everything related to IFR and any kind of navigation. It's just typically well overcomplicated and overdone. And it's very difficult for people to just look at a flight plan and say, I know what I'm going to be doing. It's just not the same thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down a little bit right now of what you guys need to know right now. Now, if you are on the stream right now, watching this live, you might see the iPad screen bounce back and forth a little bit. That's because I'm using my laptop to record this. And because of that, whenever I swipe my mouse back and forth on the laptop, it makes the screen bounce just a little bit. So you should be aware of that. In the meantime, let's go ahead and dig right into this. This history lesson that I'm going to be giving you right now is not exactly completely accurate. It's more like history with Toby, where Toby makes up some of it. But that's okay, because the point here is I want to be able to teach you guys instrument navigation by using stick figures and a whiteboard. So if I can teach you history with stick figures and a whiteboard and it makes you a better pilot, who cares if it's perfectly accurate? The point here is learning. So this is a semi-fictional story about how excuse me, about how instrument pilot navigation came to be. So let's start from square one, basics of instrument navigation. Think back to the Pony Express, where across the United States of America, when the mail routes were being built, they would use ponies, horses, to ride the mail from point to point. And as the mail carriers took the mail from point to point, they would find new trails and new roads to, navigate along their route, riding their horses. Well, similarly, when airplanes began to be used for aerial transportation of mail, the similar type of thing happened. Pilots would actually use the flights that they previously took as data for their next flights. So if I took a flight from, point A to point B, I'm going to draw that out here on the iPad. If I drew a flight from point A or flew a flight from point A to point B, I would say, okay, I learned that on this particular route of my flight, X, Y, and Z happened at A, B, and C points. So I can use that information for my next flight and say, okay, I think what I'm going to do on the next time is, because there's a mountain, at this first point, and there's a large tower or something at this next point, or maybe there's an area of bad weather over at this point, and the reason the weather's bad over there is because the wind comes across the mountain at this certain angle, and it creates a problem or whatever. I have reasons for writing down the events that happened to me on that route. So what I do is I write all those things down on my napkin or whatever, on my piece of paper, and then I give that to the next pilot that goes and flies that same route and says, hey, when I took this flight, this happened. I want you to watch out for this. And this would all be done visually, right? In fact, if you guys remember Jeppesen, right? Jeppesen, the guy that makes those charts. Mr. Jeppesen, and this might be a semi-fictional story. I believe this is true, but I'm just going to go ahead and give you my rendition, the abridged version, just to kind of give you an idea. But Jeppesen, the guy who invented the use of Jeppesen charts like we see nowadays. He was an airmail pilot, I believe. And what he did is he actually took his flights that he did as a mail carrier, and on those flights, he would take his route. He would go through the mountains and the valleys and whatever, and he would, find the lighthouses or the markings on the ground, whatever landmarks that he would use to navigate. And as he did that, he would write down where he was and what he was doing. And his notes that he took from these flights became so accurate that other pilots began to say, you know what? I think old Jeppesen's got the right idea. We want his copies of his navigation logs. So they would take the copies of his navigation logs and the copies of his notes and use those in their own navigation as a form of a chart. And those same types of charts are what we use today. Of course, they've been modernized, of course, in more details. But we use that same information now today as a way of knowing, hey, if you're going to fly from point A to point B, you need to know about these obstacles, about these points, these frequencies, and whatever, and you'll be able to get there safely. So people will just write information down and share it with their next pilot, and that's how they would navigate. They would do it visually or on instruments. But I'm going to kind of fast forward a little bit to give it a little bit more context into what's going on here. So let's fast forward a bit to World War II. Okay, so this is again semi-fictional. Some of this actually happened, but the story that I'm going to be making up is kind of an abridged version. So let's say that and during World War II, right, the Luftwaffe would go over and they would fly across the English Channel and they would drop bombs on England. And in doing that, they first started doing that visually, right? They would look outside and they would navigate to the points where they need to drop their bombs. So if you see here on my iPad, those who are watching on the stream, you'll see on my iPad we have the English Channel, drawn out here, and then we have the coast of France over here, and then we have the coast of England over here. So what you'll find out about the way that they did navigation is that you could look outside and you can navigate pretty easily by looking at landmarks and checkpoints. However, the Germans tended to fly all their missions or most of their missions at night. And because they did them at night, it was very difficult to see where they were going and what they were doing. So combine night with the potential of poor weather. You've got clouds, you've got poor visibility, whatever. They needed a way to be able to navigate from their departure airport, their departure airbase, to their target, which I'm drawing on the iPad now. They needed to be able to do that accurately without being able to visually see what was going on. So what they did is they used a form of navigational signals that they had been using in the civilian world before the war to beam across the English Channel to where their pilots could navigate along those radio frequencies and then get to their point to drop the bombs. So I'm going to draw down here another example of what that might have looked like during the beginning stages of instrument navigation. So back in the beginning of aerial navigation, when it comes to instruments, there was a technology, and I forget the exact name of this, but I'm just breaking this down with stick figures, right? As a technology where you could put this radio signal, this radio tower, basically, at the end of a runway. And let's just say that there's a radio tower right here, and there's a radio tower right here on my dot. So there's basically a radio tower on one side of the runway and a radio tower on the other. And these radio towers, what they would do is they would beam frequencies in a kind of a cone-shaped direction out towards the final approach. And there would be one that would beam out dots of Morse code on your radio. So you go doot, 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 like a dot, right? And then the other side would put out dashes. And it would be a doot, doot, doot. It'd be long dashes as opposed to short dots. And what that did is if the pilot was lined up on the right side of the course, and I'm not sure if it was the right or left side, I keep forgetting, but purposes of conversation, if the pilot was on the side with the dashes, then he knows, oh, I'm on the, let's say, the right side of the course. I hear dashes, so I need to turn left to get back on course. Or if they were on the opposite side, all they heard was dots. Then you would hear a deep, 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 and that would say, okay, I'm on the left side of the course now. So they were able to navigate pretty accurately that way. And then what happened is when you got to the middle of the course where those radio signals overlapped, the tone would actually turn solid. So the dots would actually fill the spots where the dashes were and cause a solid tone. So if you were coming from, say, the left to the right, you would hear dots first, followed by solid tone when the course was intercepted. So it might be something like a and when you heard that solid tone, you were on course. And that kind of looks like this on the iPad. You'll see that the dots here kind of fill the spot where the dashes are left blank. So you would have a solid tone that guides you directly to the end of the runway. It's very interesting, kind of a basic idea of how that worked. So the Germans basically figured out that you could take these radio signals, increase the power on them, and shoot them a farther distance and make them tighter in accuracy. So what they would do is they would take these radio signals, and I'm going to draw a little example of a tower here. So we're going to say that this right here on my iPad, this mark here represents the radio station that was transmitting the radio signal. So that radio signal was then transmitted straight out across the English Channel towards the point where the Germans wanted to drop their bombs. Now, of course, my artistic abilities aside, for those who are watching watching this live, the place where these signals were heard was the radios in the airplane. So, the airplane pilots, the pilots would tune their radios to the proper frequency where the signals came from, and then they would listen to it. The navigator would listen to it. They would hear the dots and the dashes, and they would be able to use that to say, hey, you need to fly north, you need to fly south, whatever, and the pilot would fly that and get on the course. So they would fly that direction, and then as they fly that direction for long enough, they would eventually get to their point. Cool, they can navigate. So imagine this. Imagine the airplane takes off of his base, and this example that I have right here on my iPad, the base is to the east, and the tower where the radio signal is coming from is to the southwest of that airfield. So let's say that the airplane takes off out of the airbase and they fly west for a little while. They fly west, keep on flying west until they intercept that course, that beam. As they intercept that beam, the dots would turn, or the dashes or dots would turn to solid lines, and they would be able to say, hey, I'm on course, I'm now going to turn on course. So that's what they would do. They would turn on course, and they would fly that course all the way to their bombing location. Now, again, I'm paraphrasing and using the abridged version on all of this. So some of this may not be exactly 100% accurate to the exact technology, but it does bring up the main point, the premise of how this navigation was done. So anyway, they would fly along that beam. Now, the next point here is, okay, well, that makes sense, but how did they know when they reached the point where they needed to drop their bombs? And that's as simple as a second signal from a second radio transmitter that points a beam in, from a different station that allows the triangulation of the two radio signals to intersect at one point. So if I draw that out on my iPad here, you'll see there's a secondary radio station here north of the airfield, whereas the first one was to the southwest. That second station will then send the beam right towards the target and cross right over the target. As that beam crosses over the target, the pilots would continue flying on their first beam, and they would tune their secondary radio into the frequency of the second station. And I'm going to draw down station A and station B. Station B is the one that they're using to do cross navigation. And for anybody that is listening to this podcast live and you are wondering where we are at in this discussion, the whole point of this discussion is basic IFR navigation. It's the history of how we started navigating as pilots in IFR, in IMC conditions. And one of the very first pilots to actually successfully fly on instruments using radio navigation was Jimmy Doolittle. Was a pilot during World War II. He was actually the pilot, the commanding officer that led the mission where the Americans did their first raid on the island of Japan, where they took the B-25 bombers off of the aircraft carriers and did a little of a bombing mission on Japan during World War II. And that was he was the guy, Jimmy Doolittle, that flew the bombers off the aircraft carriers. It was a very historic mission, very, very significant in that war. But moving forward, we're talking about this navigation and how this all comes down to the modern day of how we navigate as pilots. So moving back to the previous part of the conversation, the first radio signal from Station A sends a beam off towards London. We'll say that's where they're going to bomb. They're going to bomb London. So sends the signal off towards London during World War II. And then the secondary station, Station B, sends off a second signal that also crosses London. So the idea is that when the bomber pilots get close enough to the second radio beam that they start hearing the dots again, they'll hear doot, 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 doot. Eventually it's going to go to a solid tone and go doop. And when it says a solid tone, that means that the pilot is over their intended bombing point. They're over the place to drop their bombs, in which case they would drop their bombs when both signals are intersected. And from that point, they would drop their bombs, and then to get back home, they would join, the same course in the opposite direction to get back to their home base. This is all done at night. Now, this is a very basic example of what's happening, and all this right here is actually oversimplified, because they would actually use multiple frequencies and just the one to navigate. They would actually use multiple frequencies so that they would know how to tell their ground speed. They would know how to tell their wind angles and drift and all those types of things. So it was very interesting how this technology worked. But as far as we're concerned, this is what happened. This is the very basics of using radios to navigate. And I'm not sure if any of you guys have ever wondered about this. When I was a new IFR pilot, I had no idea how pilots were able to use radios to navigate. Like, I didn't really understand that at first. So, you can kind of sit here and think, you can wonder, okay, well, how do we use a radio, something that we actually listen to navigate? I don't understand how that works. So after doing some research and kind of figuring it out, I realized that it's actually just as simple as the fact that you can send out radio signals. See, all a radio signal is an electromagnetic pulse, right? So basically, I'm going to use, for those of you who are watching the video now, I've got my Apple Pencil right here. And let's imagine that this is an antenna, and I put a wire at the end of that antenna, and I send an electrical pulse up this antenna. The electrical signal goes up the antenna, bounces off the top, comes back down, and goes back and forth, back and forth. That creates a pulse along this antenna, which puts an electromagnetic signal in directions all around it. Now, as that happens, that pulse creates a wave of energy. That wave of energy is the same things that we refer to as radio waves. You can have a frequency of how many times that pulse goes back and forth. You get your radio frequency, and the wavelength is how far away that wave can actually get. So the length of the wave. And you can use all this stuff with a voltage and amps and all these different pieces and bits of technology to be able to put the radio waves and the frequencies to the exact point where you can distinguish one radio wave from another and use it for different things. I won't get into too deep in the details of that, but basically it was like, okay, you can use the same radio waves that we use to listen to the radio, but convert them into a signal that can be used for navigation for long term. And as we see right here, just by hearing, oh, I'm left of course, so I hear a dot, or I'm right of course, so I hear a dash, and if it's solid, I must be on course. Same thing applies here. We can use those signals that way. Now, of course, in modern avionics, we don't have dots and dashes that we listen to except for identifying our stations, but the same radio frequencies are transformed into a different type of radio band or radio frequency that is listened to and picked up by our navigation receivers. And since those receivers pick up those electromagnetic fields, they can actually convert them using timers and clocks and math and different things that you have built into these radios into signals that our VOR or ADF receivers can pick up and convert into, oh, you're this side of course, you're that side of course, you're left or right, and whatever. So it's very interesting how it all kind of came around to end up being just like VORs or ADFs or NDBs or anything like that. So it's very interesting kind of how that works. But now, moving on to the rest of the conversation, we'll go back to the iPad here, and let's look and see how all this turned out to be with, say, VORs, right? So Actually, tell you what, let's not do VORs first. Let's talk about NDBs first. So what is an NDB and how does it work and why do we care about this? How do they use this type of navigation to navigate? So let's say that there is an airplane that was wanting to fly from this airport here, airport A, and they wanted to fly down to airport B, which is down in a different direction. So the distance is too far, or maybe the weather outside is poor and you can't see what you're doing. Because that's the thing is normally as pilots, we can navigate visually. In fact, instrument flight rules with GPS and all this stuff is only relatively recent. Most people have been flying for the past, let's say from the early times of flying in the early 1900s to the 40s and most of the 40s, some into the 50s, was mostly visual. It was visual until it had to be instruments. So now it seems like we fly instruments until it has to be visual, but that's just because, we are children of the magenta and we like our GPSs, we like our pink lines, we like our G1000s because we forgot the lost art of how to actually fly an airplane. That's really quite sad. But anyway, all this to say, if I was going to fly from, point A to point B, I would just point the airplane that direction, get a wind correction angle from my E6B and my winds of law forecast and just fly. But, whatever. But in this case, I can't do that. I have to be able to navigate there without seeing where I'm going. So what you could do is you could actually fly. In the old days, they would fly from city to city. So they'd fly from airport A to this large city here, and they would fly to the next large city, so many miles away from that, maybe in a zigzag pattern until they eventually got to their destination. Now, you're wondering, well, why would they fly to cities? Well, think about it. What do cities have? Cities have radio towers. And what do radio towers have? Frequencies. And what kind of frequencies can the instruments in the airplanes pick up? They can pick up AM frequencies, they can pick up FM frequencies, they can pick up a variety of frequencies. But the type of frequency I want to talk about right now is the kind of frequency emitted by a non-directional beacon, an NDB. This is basically an AM radio station. In fact, that's really all it is. It's AM radio. So if you are flying down here in the Nashville area and you tuned the AM radio frequency of, I forget the actual frequency, but the one where the Titans play football or, the Grand Ole Opry is playing their music or whatever, you tune to that frequency, you'll be able to actually turn your ADF in your airplane to that frequency, and it will point an arrow. It will point your ADF arrow, automatic direction finder, ADF, there we go. It will point the ADF arrow at that station where the music is coming from or where the football game is coming from. It's very interesting. A lot of you guys may have not known this, that AM frequencies are what NDBs run off of. So if you guys are not sure, well, how do I navigate using an ADF? Well, you're probably not going to have to because you have GPS these days. But if you did navigate via ADF, you could actually tune in the frequency of a local AM radio station and fly to that. So that's what pilots would do. They would fly from city to city using AM radio stations. Now, sometimes it doesn't work, as well as you would like it to, but it could be done. They would fly to that station, and then after that station, they would fly to the next station and the next station until eventually they zigzag their way to the airport they're trying to go to. And they can do that. There's more ways they can complicate this and make it more precise, but this is just a basic way of kind of how that worked. So before I get into the rest of this conversation, I'm going to give a quick shout out from our sponsor, which is me, by the way. The IFR Mastermind community is sponsoring this episode of the IFR podcast. Basically, the IFR Mastermind is an IFR Mastermind community where pilots and instructors of all shapes and sizes come together to master the art of IFR, instrument flight rules. We've got a community full of examiners, pilots, air traffic controllers, military guys, civilian guys, all across the world, not just the United States. We're all dedicated to coming together to learn on how we can simplify IFR to where more people can just get it. The idea is this: too many people overcomplicate IFR, and my goal is to actually kill that. I want to kill the overcomplications, and I want to make it easy for people. The problem is most people, including the FAA sometimes, unfortunately, tend to overcomplicate instrument flight rules. We tend to make it significantly harder than it has to be. And to get away from this, I've decided that it is more practical to oversimplify things and make things down to where we're just talking about stick figures, like I'm drawing on the iPad here, stick figures and radio towers and World War II and people writing charts on napkins and stuff. If we can just get back to the simple times of IFR and start looking at what actually got us to where we are today, then all the complex stuff these days will make sense. We have to have a good foundation. So if you are an instrument student, pilot, or instructor looking to grow in IFR, to get your specific questions answered, and have a community of experienced mentors to guide you and walk you through that entire process of becoming an instrument pilot or instructor, and have accountability partners to keep you going the whole time, the IFR Mastermind is for you. If you want to get on the IFR Mastermind, you can click the link in my bio on Instagram or the link on the description of the YouTube video. You can also DM me on Instagram the word link. DM me the word link, LINK, and I will send you the link to the IFR Mastermind. We do weekly group calls for instrument training and proficiency. We had one this morning and one yesterday. Typically, they're Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. However, that schedule does change because I am a pilot and so are the other guys doing the coaching calls. We've had a lot of help. A lot of people have gotten help in this training, and it's great. We want to be able to reach more people with practical IFR training, and you can help us do that by becoming a member of the IFR Mastermind. I love to get to know every single person in the Mastermind. I want to know you by your name. I want to know where you're from. I want to know what's going on. What airplanes do you fly? Just like what keeps you ticking. If we can all do that, we can build a great community of tight-knit aviators that want to master IFR. So the place to master IFR is the IFR Mastermind. So click the link in my bio or DM me the word link, and we will get you into that. Moving back to the conversation about NDBs, non-directional beacons, and radio navigation. This is simply one way that we could navigate. And basically all an NDB is a radio tower that is putting out a signal that is so loud that the receiver in your airplane picks it up and points an arrow saying, hey, the tower's over there. So you would turn your airplane to that bearing and you would fly towards that tower. And you would basically do that zigzagging across the country until you get to wherever it is you're trying to go. And that works out pretty well. However, that type of technology has been phased out in most places in the country. They still have several in the Northeast and several in Alaska, but not so much in the lower 48, especially where I'm flying. So I typically don't talk too much about NDBs, but it is important to realize that it is just a radio station that puts out a sound and the antenna in the airplane can pick it up. So it's pretty cool, actually. Moving on, let's talk about how VORs kind of entered this phase. What is a VOR, right? Now, a lot of people get very confused when we talk about VORs. And the reason they get confused is because there's so many things that are going on with a VOR. It's like it's really easy to get confused and to get distracted as to what the real point is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a lesson on VORs for dummies, because I am a dummy and I need dummy talk to understand VORs. So this is basically what is happening. A VOR is a radio station with antennas on it. The antennas shoot signals in 360 directions, 360 degrees. Those signals are picked up by the receiver in your airplane. So I'm going to draw an example of a VOR on my iPad. This is a VOR on the iPad. Now, if you're listening to the podcast, you can't see it, but just imagine I drew a dot on the screen. That is a VOR. That VOR is transmitting a radio wave in a certain direction. And it's got 36 little antennas that put out radio waves in 360 degrees of the compass. And those radio waves are unique because every time you get on one of those waves, the wave length, the wave frequency is just maybe slightly different. It's got a slightly different way it's set up. Now, technically speaking, it's all the same frequency. However, they're inside of this VOR and the instruments in the airplane. There's clocks, there's timers, there's little spinny devices that actually can tell which radio beam that you are on relative to the station based on the time that takes from the little clock and the instrument to, go from the first point to second point. It's a whole bunch of complicated stuff we're not going to talk about. What you need to know right now is basically a VOR is a device that shoots out a very specific and directional radio wave. And these radio waves are called radials. radial, R-A-D-I-A-L, because it radiates from the station. And you got 360 of these little puppies. Now, this is really nice because unlike an NDB, where it's a non-directional beacon, a VOR is a directional type of beacon. A VOR stands for VHF, which stands for very high frequency, which is a type of radio frequency that we're using, VHF, very high frequency, omnidirectional range. Now, this is a lot of fancy words, but I'm going to boil it down to make it super simple. VHF means it's a radio. Omnidirectional means it goes in directions all around. It is omnidirectional. So it's not just a non-directional, it is directionally accurate in any direction. And then it is a range, which just means, it goes away. It ranges away. So a VHF omnidirectional range, VOR. So how do I use a VOR for navigation? I'm so glad you guys asked. Man, y'all are the absolute best podcast audience I think I've ever had. So let's go into how the VORs work. So how do I navigate? I am going to draw an example right here of an airport. We're going to fly from airport A to airport B. I know you guys are wondering, well, why don't we fly from airport C to airport D maybe instead? That would be a little bit more, unique. Toby, come on, you've been using airport A and airport B all day. Well, hey, deal with it. So going back to this, I want to fly from airport A to airport B. And let's say that it's too far of a distance for me to navigate visually, or I don't have GPS or whatever, or let's just go back to the weather's bad. I have poor weather. There's a big cloud, in between airport A and airport B, and I cannot navigate, visually. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a radio station with the radio equipment in my airplane to accurately navigate from A to B. Now, I can't go in a straight line, unfortunately, because the weather won't allow it. There's no way for me to accurately know where I am in space. I don't have visual landmarks to confirm my location. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate to the VOR that is in between airport A and airport B. Now, not every airport pair has a VOR directly in between, which is unfortunate, but some do. So in this case, we're going to say that there is a VOR that is over here to the, the northeast here. This is our VOR. And this VOR, its frequency is, 123.45 or whatever the frequency is, doesn't matter. I am going to find a way to navigate from A to the VOR, then to B. So what I'll do is I plot out on my chart. I say, what is the course for me to get from where I currently am, which is airport A, to that VOR? So I take my plotter out on the map, and I'm using the ruler on the iPad for those who are watching the live stream. I take my plotter on the map, and I draw a line from the A to the VOR. And then as I do that, I figure out what course is that. Well, in this case, that course is a 090 course. So I'm flying 090 course to that VOR. So what I would do is as I take off in the airplane and I begin my flight, I'm going to draw this in a different color. I would take off from airport A, and let's say I take off to the north. Take off to airport A, and I'm heading, slightly northeast, for whatever reason. What I'll do is I'll tune in my airplane, in my course deviation indicator, which is the device in the airplane that you use to navigate via VORs. I'm going to draw that out on the iPad. Basically, I would tune the course that I want to fly to the VOR, which is a course of 090. I would tune that to the top of my VOR indicator with my omni-bearing selector, which is called an OBS. You guys will learn about that in your instrument training if you haven't already. I will tune the course that I want to go to the station in my box. Now, as I do that, if I start flying north of that radial, north of that course, the needle will start to show on the instrument towards the south, saying, hey, the VOR is currently south of your current position. So 180 is what it would show on that instrument. So I would need to actually turn my airplane to a south heading or somewhere in that vicinity to get back to that radial so I can fly to that VOR. So that's what I would do. I would turn my heading to say south or maybe, southeast or something like that, and I would get to that radial. As soon as that radial centers on my CDI, on my instrument, I will know, hey, I am now on the 090 course that I want to be to that VOR. Now, the 090 course to the VOR is not the 090 radial. The 090 radial is the one that goes from the VOR. It radiates from the VOR, right? So in this case, I'm actually on the 270 radial. So I'm located on 270, but I am flying the 090 course. I found that if you talk about courses, it's a lot easier to figure out in your head than it is to talk about radials. Radials are a little bit more confusing for a lot of people. So I just say I want to fly a line to the VOR on 090. So that's what I do. I plug it in at the top and I go. You'll notice on your VOR indicator, there will be a flag that says 2. It'll have a little triangle that points up and it will say 2 on it. That 2 flag means that if you are on the side of the VOR where that course is, in this case, you are on the west side of that VOR because you have selected to go towards it to the east, you have to fly 090 to get to the station. For those of you who didn't get that explanation, I'm going to give a different explanation that's even simpler. If you plug in 090 at the top of your CDI, and then you center the needle, and the indication says 2, that means you must fly a course of 090 to get to the VOR. That's it. More explanations for that, drop them in the comments on the podcast, and we will review them later. In the meantime, we navigate to this radial and we fly. Cool. So that's what I'm going to do. I found the 090 radial. I took off. I flew towards it. And now the radial is centered. I can fly 090 to stay on that course, and I will fly that all the way to the VOR. Now, as I get closer and closer to the VOR, the needle will get more and more sensitive because the closer to the VOR, the closer the radials are together because they are radiating from the VOR, right? So that means there's more of them in a closer vicinity. So the needles will get more sensitive. As I get to the VOR, a couple things are going to happen. Number one, it increases sensitivity. Awesome. Number two is that there's a cone of confusion, you could call it, over the top of this VOR. And what the cone of confusion is this. I will show you what I'm talking about. On the VOR, there is an area where the signal that goes from that VOR can no longer be picked up by the instruments in the airplane. Basically, if it's like a cone, imagine a traffic cone that is upside down, sitting on top of a VOR. It looks kind of like that. If you fly the airplane over top the VOR and you get within that cone area, that cone-shaped area, you will have a loss of signal over that VOR because the VOR signals aren't going straight up. They're going outwards, not up. So if you're directly over the VOR, you're not going to get proper signal. But once you cross that VOR and go out on the other side of the VOR now, outside of that cone of confusion, you will have signal backed in again. Some people have called it the silence cone. Some people have called it the cone of confusion. Doesn't matter. But the point is inside of that cone, the area directly over top of the VOR and slightly outwards of the VOR is an area where you will not have any signal. So that being said, that will happen. Now, it's commonly asked question is, okay, well, we talked about the 2 indication on the VOR and how it shows right here on my CDI that I am flying to the station on a 090 course. Cool. Well, what about from? What does the from thing do? It's the same exact thing, guys. Same exact thing. And that thing is this. I'm flying the airplane now. I'm drawing it out on the iPad now for those who are watching the live stream. I'm drawing this out now. And as soon as I cross that VOR, I'm no longer going to the VOR. I'm going from the VOR now. Simple. I'm still on the 090 course, right? So I've crossed the VOR now. Now I'm on the opposite side, traveling east. As I do that, the flag on the instrument will switch from a to indication, like it was, to now being a from indication. It will have the triangle point down and it will say from on it, because now if I fly, watch this guys, if I fly 090 and I am on the other side of that VOR, I'm going from the VOR. I'm going from the VOR on a 090 course, as opposed to being on the other side when I'm going to the VOR on a 090 course. That should clear that up for anybody who's confused. And if you're still confused, that's totally fine. You can join the IFR Mastermind program and ask those questions in our coaching calls and have them answered by an expert instructor. So one of the guys we have on the team, possibly myself, and we'll be able to get that question answered for you specifically. And the question that you ask, everyone else will want to know the answer to as well. So that works out pretty well. Moving forward, we understand to, we understand from. If I am on the, if I have the 090 course selected, if I am on the east side of the VOR, it's going to say from, because if I fly 090, I'm going from the VOR. But if I have the 090 course selected and I am on the west side of the VOR, well, obviously going to the VOR, would be on a 090 course. So 090 takes me to the VOR. So that works out pretty well. I'm going to move back to my previous discussion on how all this works. I'm going to erase these markings that I have on my iPad for the valued viewers on the stream, and we're going to continue. So I have gotten to the VOR now. Okay, so I have now arrived at the VOR. Cool. Now what do I do? How do I continue to my destination at point B? Simple. Same thing I did before. I pull out my handy dandy ruler and I draw a line from the VOR to the place of intended travel, which is point B, airport B. And then I look at my course on there and I see, okay, this looks like a course of let's say I make it up something, it's 160. This is a 160 course to get to my destination. So I will fly a 160 course from the VOR. So now I take the indication that I had here on my CDI, that was 090, and I turn that knob. Let's see here. I'm going to erase some stuff on my iPad. There we go. Those of you who are on the podcast listening, I'm erasing things on my iPad to show our viewers. So I will turn my OBS knob to 160 because I want to fly a 160 course from the VOR. As I turn that 160, the little needle in the CDI is going to be changed. I'll tell you why. When I was doing this flight, what happened is I flew from my departure airport to the first VOR. I fly over the VOR, and as soon as that flag goes from a to indication to now on the other side a from indication, I am now off course. See, I have to now fly slightly to the southwest to join that 160 course. Kind of like how you overshoot your waypoint and you have to turn back to recenter your needles. So in this case, I flew east of the radial. The radial that I'm trying to join now, the course is the 160. So I am now east of that course because I flew, past the VOR. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my CDI and see what it says. You'll notice that my CDI is now deflected to the west slightly. I draw my letter here. There we go. It's deflected to the west. Since it's deflected towards the west, say, it'd be somewhere close to like 250 or something like that. It shows 250 on my CDI. So what does that mean I need to do? I need to fly a course somewhere between 160 and 250 in order to now intercept that radial. So let's pick a heading. Let's say I'm going to fly a heading of 200, which is right here. I will now turn the airplane, draw it up on my iPad. I'm going to turn the airplane to a heading of 200, just like this. And by flying 200, that needle that I have right here on the 160 will begin to get closer and closer and closer and closer and closer to the center of the CDI until eventually it centers. When that needle centers, I know I am on my desired course, my desired radial of 160, in which case I will join that radial and I will fly a 160 course all the way down to my destination. Now, when do I get to my destination? When will that be? Well, a couple things. Some VORs have technology called a DME, which is called distance measuring equipment. This distance measuring equipment is basically the same frequency that the VOR is used on can also be used to tell how far away you are from that VOR. So if you have the little box in the airplane with a DME on it, you tune the frequency and it will actually use the same frequencies from before along with a timer to calculate how far you are from that VOR. And it uses slant range distance. So if you are 6,000 feet directly over the VOR, it will show you as being 1 mile from the VOR. So there's some accuracy errors there, but I could use that and say, okay, well, when my airport is 20 miles away, so when the DME says 20, then I must be over the airport. Alternatively, you could use timing to figure this out. You could say, okay, well, if I'm flying, 20 miles, 20 miles at, let's say, 80 knots or 100 knots or 120 knots is however many minutes it is. And you would say, okay, well, I'll fly this radial for so many minutes and then I should get to my airport. And that's the way you can navigate that way. Of course, it is not very precise. And in instrument navigation, we like to be more precise than that. But again, this is old-fashioned navigation. How do I get from point A to point B? And that's basically what I'm looking for there. So hope that makes sense to you guys as far as how that works. Basically, to get from A to B using a VOR, I'm first going to select the course to the VOR from A. And then when I get to the VOR, I'm going to select the course from the VOR to get me to B. And I will simply fly those needles to get from A to B. Now, the last concept that I would like to explain to you guys on the podcast and on the live stream is how did area navigation come to be? What is area navigation? So you're wondering, okay, this is great, Toby. I understand if I want to go from A to B, I got VORs I can use, I got NDBs I can use, I got so many things I can use. But let's say that I'm sick and tired of flying in zigzag lines across the country. I mean, come on, airport A is, over here. Airport B is, again, down here where it always has been. And, I've got a VOR, I've got a VOR to the left. I've got one to the right. I've got one to the left. I've got VORs all across the country that I can use to navigate to airport B. But as you can see, it's a zigzag the whole way. I could do something like this. I could zigzag from here to here to here to here. I mean, there's so many different routes I could take to get there, but none of them are direct routes. So how do we get direct routes from A to B using VORs? Well, you can't unless you have something called RNAV. RNAV stands for Area Navigation. It's where you're able to navigate point to point navigation using technology in the airplane. Old style RNAV consists of a VOR receiver with a little computer that uses VOR navigation technology to artificially move VORs in a position to where the airplane's receiver thinks the VOR is wherever you put it. Now you're wondering, what in the world is he talking about? Well, I'm going to explain it to you now. Instead of me flying a zigzag flight from A to B, oops, my eraser, wrong button, my bad. Unless you want to fly, a straight line from A to B to C to D, and then eventually get back to your airport, which we don't want to do, we have to use an RNAV. So here's how this works. An RNAV takes the VOR that we have selected on our RNAV box. An RNAV box, by the way, is just a simple radio. You plug in your VOR frequency, 110.6, and then what you do is you plug in the distance from the VOR that you want to be and the radial from the VOR that you want to go to. You're like, oh, what is he talking about? Let me show you. Here I have drawn a straight line from A to B. This is my course. This is what I want to fly. How do I make this VOR right here get me to that line? Well, it's very simple. I'm going to artificially move this VOR using the RNAV, and here's how I do it. This VOR, I can draw the radial from that VOR. Let's say that VOR is 10 miles from the course. And the radial which that course is on is, let's say that is on the 220 radial, the 220 radial. What I do is I'll take this information and I'll plug it into my RNAV. And then what I'll do is I'll take the information from the other VOR, and let's say this one is also 10 miles from the course, but it's on a 030 radial. So what I would do is I would plug that into my RNAV as well. And then the last VOR here, let's say it's 8 miles from the course, and it is on the the 230 radial or something like that. So 230 radial and say 10 miles. What I do is I plug those VORs into the RNAV and tell the RNAV box that I want this VOR to no longer be here. I want it to actually move to right here. And I want the RNAV box to make the airplane's CDI, like the instrument that I actually use. I want the CDI with the needle and the line and all the numbers at the top and everything. I want all this information to think the VOR is in a new position. So that's what I do. I plug it in, and by plugging it in, I'm able to move this VOR exactly on course to where I want to go. So now, instead of flying from A to the VOR originally, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm going to fly from A to the VOR that I have moved on course, and then I'll tune frequencies to the next frequency, 114.0 or whatever, right? Which is off of the 030 radial at 10 miles. I plug all that information in, and then it moves the second VOR to my route. And I now fly direct to that fake VOR. And then I fly after that a route to this fake VOR that I've plugged in. So RNAV actually moves the VORs artificially along your route. It's very cool how that works. Now, we don't typically use this type of navigation today because we have GPS and other types of RNAV, area navigation systems. But this is how the original RNAV was designed to work. And it's very, very cool. But of course, nowadays, we don't have to use any of that. We can just use GPS, and the GPS can take us direct from A to B without any problems. However, in order for us to appreciate GPS and appreciate how all this stuff works, we have to first understand RNAV, and then we have to first understand radio navigation from the very beginning of history. How do we navigate? And then we got to ADF, NDBs, radio frequencies. Then we got to VORs and radials and courses and all this stuff, and eventually we know how to navigate. So the last thing that we are going to discuss today before the end of this podcast is charts. How do we take all this information that we just learned and turn it into a charted procedure? Well, remember what I said about Jeppesen? Imagine this. You got a guy, walks up to the guy at the FBO at the airport and says, "Hey man, I am looking to fly from airport A to airport B." And the old guy at the airport says, "All right, no, you want to fly from airport A to airport B? Okay, well, what are you trying to do? What are you flying?" And you say, "Well, I'm flying in my Cessna 210 Centurion, and there's some bad weather coming up, and I don't want to fly around that weather, but there's also some mountains, down here to the south, and I don't want to hit those mountains, and I can't fly in the clouds and whatever. So how do I get from airport A to airport B?" Or I should say, he can't fly in the clouds. He's instrument rated. Of course, he's flying in the clouds. How do I get there? I don't want to hit any of these mountains or this whatever's going on, right? So the old guy at the airport says, "All right, now listen to me. I've flown this route many times before. I know exactly what I'm doing. Here's what you need to know. You need to fly from A to the X VOR. And from the X VOR, you need to fly to the Y VOR. Now, when you do this and you fly from A to X, you need to be at least 3,000 feet, because if you're lower than that, you're going to hit this water tower or something like that. I don't know. You're going to hit a tower, so avoid that. And then from X to Y, you're going to fly this particular course. You're going to fly a course of 100 degrees, and you climb up to 6,000. Now, the reason you're climbing to 6,000 is because there's a mountain range in between that route of flight. And that mountain range actually causes the signal of the X VOR to be degraded. So once you get a few miles past X, you actually need to switch over to the Y VOR to receive it, because once you get past that mountain range, you're not going to be able to pick up the X VOR anymore. So you need to change over from the X to the Y. And by the way, for you guys who know how charts work, that right there is called a changeover point. You change over. How do we know that? Because we've experienced the fact that the signal is lost. So experienced pilots know how to navigate because they've done it before, they've messed up, they learned from it, right? So we change over. And you need to fly at 6,000 feet, because if you don't, you won't have any signal. But once you get past about 10 miles or 20 miles from the YVOR, you can descend down to 3,000 feet again, because there's not any terrain or signal problems that you're going to have. Okay, cool. We get that. And then from Y, you're just going to fly a course of, 40 degrees for 10 miles, and you're going to get to B. No problems. So this guy just told me how to navigate. He wrote it all on a piece of paper, and I took that in the plane with me and I flew it. And this got me from A to B safely. I have altitudes, I have courses, I know where terrain is, I know where I need to switch my radio frequencies. I know all this information that I previously did not know how to navigate by. This is how the basics of charts were created. Is people came through it and were like, hey, I need to figure out how to get from A to B without killing myself. How do I do it? So local common knowledge of how to navigate occurred. So that is the basics of how that works. And now we have charts for days and days and days. And it all started with Jeppesen and those guys putting it together. Last point we're going to discuss is this. There's only 3 phases in instrument flight you need to know about right now, and there's 2 rules per phase. There is the departure phase, there is the en route phase, and there is the arrival phase. Between these phases, there's only 2 rules that you need to know. Rule number 1 is navigate. Cool, got that. Rule number 2 is don't hit stuff. If you can navigate and not hit stuff, you're going to be okay. The trick is, how do we navigate and how do we not hit stuff? This happens visually, in visual meteorological conditions, and it happens using instruments. So how do we do this? So it comes down to this. You can navigate visually by using your eyeballs, right? You look at where you're trying to go and don't hit stuff. If you see a mountain, you should probably avoid the mountain. Don't hit the mountain. Look outside. Use your eyeballs. Air traffic control will say, number 1, 2, 3, 4, can you maintain your own terrain and obstruction clearance between your present altitude and 5,000 or whatever? And you're going to say, if you can maintain that clearance visually, you'll say affirmative. I can maintain my own separation from the terrain and obstacles. If you can't, you'll say, nope, I can't do it. Give me some other instruction. And they'll give you some other instruction. So eyeballs is one way you can navigate. And it also helps you from hitting stuff. Another way to navigate is through the FAA's published procedures, right? So whatever is published. This is going to be a combination of local knowledge. Really what it is local knowledge. It's all it is the FAA went out there, figured out what's it going to take to get you from A to B safely, and they published it in charts. That's going to be the same thing as you going up here and following the published airways with published altitudes, published radios, and published procedures. It's very simple. And then from there, you can follow those procedures and it gets you where you got to go. Great. And then the third point is possibly air traffic control. If you have air traffic control, they can tell you where to go and they can help you from hitting stuff. They have all the same stuff that you do with radar, or they have all the same stuff that you need. I should say this, they don't have the same stuff. What they have is minimum vectoring altitudes and you on a radar. So they can make sure you get from A to B and make sure you're not so low that you're going to hit anything in the process of doing that. So those are some great ways to navigate and not hitting stuff. They can do this for you, those 3 things. So if you can just look at each phase of your flight on departure, which departure meaning the runway to top of climb, and then en route meaning top of climb to top of descent, and then arrival being top of descent back down to the runway. How can I make sure I navigate and don't hit stuff between each of those sections? And if I can safely do that, I know I've done a successful flight plan. Now, this is oversimplified. This is basically IFR for dummies, but man, it is the best way to get this done. So that is the end of this lesson. It is now 1 hour into this episode. I am so thankful for all you guys that came on the live stream and came on the recording later for the IFR podcast. This is IFR podcast season 1, episode 3, basics of IFR navigation. And we'll see you guys next time.